The year is 1987. An elderly man sits inside of a cell in a prison in West Berlin. He's the only prisoner there, and he had been for over 20 years. Totally isolated and confined, cut off from the outside world, and left to rot as the earth moved on. If you had no idea who he was, you might even feel bad for the guy. But everyone was acutely aware of who he was, and they were determined to see it through that he died there. He'd been handed his sentence 4 decades prior, a lifetime ago by many counts, in a German city you might have heard of. Nuremberg. This was no ordinary prisoner. This was Hitler's third in command, Rudolf Hess. By 1987, he was considered to be the last ever Nazi official to still be incarcerated. And his story is almost as insane as he was. Rudolf Hess was born the son of a merchant in 1894. He was a young man by the time World War I broke out, as empires of the old world clashed in a storm of steel, mud, and horror. After the war, he studied at the University of Munich, where he engaged in nationalistic propaganda in the wake of the neutered Germany of the interwar years. In around 1920, he started to associate himself with a fledgling political party known as the National Socialist Party or Nazi Party, eventually led by its enigmatic leader, Adolf Hitler. Hess took to Hitler's teachings and charisma, and before long, he would become his friend and close confidant. After the beer hall putsch of 1923, Hess even wrote down and edited much of Hitler's dictation for Mein Kampf. This was an unabashed Nazi, a radical extremist who would show absolute loyalty to Hitler no matter what. He was also seriously mentally unstable. Ernst Putzi Hannstegel, a German-American businessman close to Hitler, recalled that Hess would, quote, not go to bed without testing with a divining rod whether there were any subterranean watercourses which conflicted with the direction of his couch. Others remembered watching him hang magnets over his head. The Fuhrer himself, even for his own inner entourage of colourful characters, often mocked his reliance on astrology, ghosts, telepathy, and mesmerism. A US government psychiatrist who examined Hess during the war crimes trials was quoted as saying, "If one considers the street as sanity and the sidewalk as insanity, then Hess spent the greater part of his time on the curb." Even Hermann Göring, Hitler's second in command, knew something was a bit off about Hess, saying of him, quote, "Hess was slightly off balance for as long as I can recall. Why the Fuhrer kept him on as head of the party was a mystery to most people. But to me, I always felt it was Hitler's loyalty to his old friends." And this was likely true. Hitler was extremely paranoid and valued loyalty over nearly anything else. Hess, if he was anything, was loyal as a dog. When talking about Hitler, he would state the following, quote, "Normally the great men that we admire from a distance lose their magic when one knows them well. With Hitler, the opposite is true." Now that's true fanaticism and dogma, which had wormed his way into his head and burrowed into every facet of his mind. It's how you get loyalty at all costs. By 1939, and owing to that loyalty, he was deemed third in line behind Hitler himself and Göring. He was an important part of the Nazi state infrastructure at the time, and Hitler trusted him to ensign much of the laws of the regime into official legislation, including the laws that would strip German Jews of their rights as the Holocaust began. It's important to make the distinction here between Rudolf Hess, Hitler's inner circle confidant, and Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, when engineering the final solution. The two, owing to their names being so similar, are frequently confused, but their stories are very different. When war broke out, despite having the ear of Herr Hitler, Hess would find himself slowly pushed out, sidelined by other top Nazi officials who deemed him as a bit mad or were simply more focused on the war effort than domestic German affairs. This was supposed to be the so-called master race, after all, and mystic nonsense had no place in the Thousand-Year Reich. So, by 1941, Hess had had enough. He wasn't being listened to, and he could see that Germany would struggle to fight a war on multiple fronts. The United Kingdom had survived the Battle of Britain in 1940, and soon Germany would launch Operation Barbarossa. It's unknown if Hess knew the details of the operation, but he most likely had an idea. However, with his influence fading by mid-1941, Hess figured he needed to do something drastic, and something fast. And so on the 10th of May 1941, in the middle of the Second World War, Rudolf Hess boarded a plane he had specially prepared at the Augsburg-Haunstetten airfield and took off for Britain. Now, you might be questioning this idea. Hess was flying right into the eye of the storm, into British airspace, where if he was discovered, he would almost certainly be shot down and killed. At this time, Britain was the only global power still fighting the Nazis that wasn't occupied by the Wehrmacht. Any German plane flying overhead would be seen as an enemy. But Hess had some correspondence with others to indicate that perhaps King George V would listen to him if he vied for peace via the Duke of Hamilton, who lived in Scotland. He managed to fly low under British radar in his small, unarmed plane. The RAF did eventually spot him and sent planes up to intercept, but Hess jumped and parachuted down, landing on a farm. The plane would eventually crash about 12 miles away from the Duke's residence. Upon being discovered, Hess was immediately arrested, as would be customary for any major enemy official during wartime. He stated repeatedly to anyone who would listen that his goal was to make peace between Germany and Britain. When interrogated, and upon arriving in Scotland, he said that, quote, "My coming to England in this way is, as I realise, so unusual that nobody will easily understand it. I was confronted by a very hard decision. I do not think I could have arrived at my final choice unless I had continually kept before my eyes the vision of an endless line of children's coffins with weeping mothers behind them, both English and German, and another line of coffins of mothers with mourning children." It appears that, even despite being an ardent Nazi, Hess felt like what he was doing was the right thing for peace in Europe. At least, if his comments are to be taken at face value. Hitler, for his part, had no clue that Hess was planning to do this, and soon distanced himself when learning about what had transpired, as he feared a potential coup. Hitler also declared Hess insane, so his Führer had truly abandoned him. Hess appeared to be deluded to the extent that he believed Hitler wanted peace with Britain, because that just wasn't true at the time. Sure, it would have allowed Germany to storm into the Russian motherland unimpeded by a second front that would come later to mainland Europe. But consider the strategic outlook for a moment here. If you're Hitler, the war's going pretty well by mid-1941. You're about to launch your surprise offensive into Russia. The USA are all the way across the Atlantic and not involved, at least not officially, and even though the Battle of Britain was a failure, there wasn't much the UK could do against a fascist Germany, Italy and Spain, with most of Europe already under occupation. In short, why would peace even be an option for Hitler at this point? Everything was just going so well. But Hess, deluded as ever, was furious he'd been kept as a prisoner instead of being treated as a peace envoy. He had demanded to meet a senior British official, and eventually Westminster decided to play along, sending the Lord Chancellor John Simon on the 10th of June 1941. But Simon denied Hess any and all audiences with the king, as well as any prospect of peace between nations. Hess was also starting to be psychologically assessed at this time, as doctors peered inside his mind to try and understand it from under the surface. Dr. Henry Dix, who was one such psychologist, said of Hess, quote, "The first impression is undoubtedly of a schizoid psychopath." Dix recognised that Hess was severely mentally unstable, being concerned that after his failed attempt at peace, that he might do something drastic, perhaps realizing that everything he had tried to accomplish was for nothing. Abandoned and rejected by his dear Führer, and with no hopes of peace in sight, Dix turned out to be correct. Days after being rebuffed by the Lord Chancellor, Hess threw himself over the banister of the staircase in the building where he was being held. He had demanded to see Dix in the early hours of the morning, then rushed towards him, jumping over the banisters and breaking his leg. As a result, when Henry Dix was interviewed later about Hess, he said, quote, "He was pathetic and pitiful rather than menacing or unpleasant. We, who surrounded him, always felt that this was a very insecure man who had been greatly damaged somehow in his earlier life, and if only better means had existed, if only he hadn't been such an important prisoner of state, we might have done more for him. He would be given medical care, but remain imprisoned as the war in Europe raged on without him. Operation Barbarossa would come and go, failing just outside the suburbs of Moscow as the bitter winter set in. The United States would also pledge their support, turning the war on its head and giving the initiative back to the Allies in both Europe and the Pacific. And as the Red Army marched closer and closer to Berlin, one can't help but wonder if Hitler considered Hess's flight and peace initiative as something of a missed opportunity. But Hess, of course, would miss all of this. In 1942, and still a British prisoner, he was moved to Mayndiff Court Military Hospital in Abergavenny, Wales, where he stayed until the end of the war. However, he would soon be repatriated and reunited with all of his closest pals and Nazi buddies back in Nuremberg, where he and all the other National Socialist officials would be tried for their crimes in the first trial of its kind. So in 1946, Rudolf Hess, amongst many others, were put on trial for crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and many other such atrocities. The emotion in the room was palpable and tense, as each senior official who was still alive was forced to reveal the depths of their depravity in chilling detail. But Hess showed all the remorse of a psychopathic serial killer. He wasn't just uncaring about the regime he'd helped to prop up that led to the suffering of untold millions. Quite the opposite. Even on trial, he was proud of it. He stated, quote, "I am happy to know that I have done my duty to my people, my duty as a German, as a National Socialist, as a loyal follower of my Führer. I do not regret anything. If I were to begin all over again, I would act just as I have acted, even if I knew that in the end I should meet a fiery death at the stake." He would be sentenced to life in prison for crimes against peace and conspiracy. And so began the second portion of Hess's life, not one where he would be revered inside a conquered Europe as an Aryan hero, but as a prisoner in chains, as he and his co-conspirators' ideology was systematically dismantled piece by piece. He and 6 other Nazi officials would spend the rest of their sentences in Spandau prison in western Berlin. Constructed in 1876, this castle-like structure was near impenetrable. Interestingly, it had previously been used by the Gestapo during Nazi rule, so how very ironic it was that it would soon house those who had once commanded them. It would be jointly controlled by a different warden from each of Berlin's occupying forces, France, the US, the Soviet Union, and Britain, who would rotate between one another monthly. By 1966, 2 decades into his life sentence, Hess was the only remaining prisoner at Spandau prison. Everyone else had either been released, died, or been absorbed into the Soviet and US programs as the Cold War silently raged in the background. He was all alone. The last Nazi. Spandau prison was a hard place to be confined. Prisoners were only to be addressed by their numbers, never their name. Hess's was number 7. This is particularly ironic given that those in the concentration camps were also dehumanized using this method. Punishments were strict. When in 1955 Hess failed to greet a Soviet warder, he lost all his reading materials for 10 days. Prisoners could be put on just bread and water or placed in punishment cells. The decades rolled on, with Hess as the sole prisoner in this huge complex. Some would eventually even feel sorry for him and call for his release by the late 1970s, when he was old and frail. Just after becoming Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington wrote a particularly strong note to his Soviet counterpart, Andrei Gromyko, in which he said, quote, "It would be both inhumane and pointless to insist that this old man should die in prison." In all, the Allies made a number of appeals for Hess to be freed. The Brits made 11, the Americans and French supported them in a further 9, but the Soviets always refused to consider the case, even long after the war, arguing that the release of such a leading figure in the Nazi regime would never be understood by the Soviet people or by any others who had suffered at their hands. One diplomat said he was not convinced by the so-called humanitarian argument, quoting again here that the suffering which he and other Nazis had inflicted was not human. How could you make a humanitarian appeal when what the Nazis had done was so horrific? But by the 80s, the regime at Spandau was a bit more relaxed. The war had been over for decades, and the chances of any Nazis coming to break Hess out of prison was getting pretty low. The whole thing was basically designed at this point to house one elderly man. So over time it became less and less harsh. Many had stopped referring to Hess by a number and instead started using his name. He was able to walk in the gardens of the prison when he chose, and although there was a rule about him not being able to watch television, it wasn't rigidly enforced by this time. He also had 2 cooks to prepare any meal he wanted. In many ways, outside of the decades of confinement, it was a better deal than he deserved, considering what victims of the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities had gone through. And so, we return to where the video began, 1987, and Rudolf Hess, the loneliest man in the world, the last Nazi, abandoned by his comrades who were freed or dead, a tiny, ideological stain on a world that had forgotten all about him, defeated his masters, and moved on. He was a relic of an era that everyone wanted to forget, but that nobody could. Eventually, in 1987, Rudolf Hess was found to have hanged himself at Spandau prison, leaving a final note at the old age of 93. He was found with a lamp cord wrapped around his neck. There was quite a bit of speculation after his death, and many believed that Hess, the frail old man, would not have the strength to have strangled himself, especially as the cord wasn't actually attached to anything. Conspiracies abounded, such as an idea that Israel, known for hunting down Nazis in the past, had somehow gotten to Hess and delivered him some karmic justice almost half a century on from the end of the war. But nobody else had access to Hess other than the warders, and their movements were accounted for. It's very likely after over 45 years of confinement and isolation, and, of course, mental instability, he decided to check himself out, unable to handle a changing world that had outgrown his toxic ideology decades ago. His legacy would be erased in all but written word. After Hess's death, the building was immediately demolished to prevent it becoming a place for neo-Nazis to pilgrimage to. A shopping centre was later built on the site, and his grave in the Bavarian village of Wunsiedel was eventually exhumed. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea to stop his gravesite acting as a kind of shrine for radical right-wingers, which had been an issue for decades. Neo-Nazis had been terrorising the small town and its inhabitants for years, coming from all over the world to pay their respects to Mr. Hess's grave. Cemetery administrator Andreas Fabel told AP News in 2011 that, quote, "The grave is now empty. The bones are gone." And so ended the sad story of Rudolf Hess, the mentally unstable ideologue and proud Nazi who was deluded into thinking that he could save his Führer with a Sig Hail Mary bid for peace. The last Nazi was no more.